Podcast Qesse, March 31st, 2015, written by Ronen Bergman. In one or two places in the article, especially towards the end, I felt that the author missed an important angle in the story's conclusion, so I also used another article. I will post the details of these references on the Facebook page. This story is a complex and very interesting spy story. It relates to Mossad and a previously well-respected, popular and very successful Mossad intelligence officer who is accused of sabotage and leaking intelligence to the extent that it endangered Israel's national security, bringing Israel close to a war based on false information. This person is then tried and convicted for sabotage, acts against national security, and theft, and goes to prison. After his release from prison for about 10 years, he doesn't talk about this case. After 10 years, a persistent journalist finally manages to get him to sit down for an interview, and also talks to several officials in Mossad and other Israeli organizations to write a relatively comprehensive report about this incident. This report is what we hear today. The story is very interesting, but given that it belongs to Mossad and is not that old yet, not all its angles are clear. But what is available is very interesting. The event that led to his conviction was that in 1996, based on information this person brought from his intelligence source, the Israeli army began moving forces near the Syrian border because Israeli security and military officials were convinced that war was imminent and Syria intended to attack Israel. Almost a year after that, rumors emerged that a high-ranking Mossad intelligence officer had been arrested for this case, and his crime was delivering false information that almost led the country to war. This Mossad employee's name is Yehuda Gil. For years, Gil was one of Mossad's most famous and popular internal employees. He was a ta'udi, a term often used for a deep-cover agent, who played a key role in a series of very important cases. For example, after the attack in the Munich Olympics where Israeli athletes were killed, he was part of the team that tracked, hunted, and assassinated members of the Black September group. He was also a key member of the team that gathered intelligence on Iraq's nuclear facilities, and based on this information, the Israelis later bombed those facilities and shut down Saddam's nuclear program. Another very important task of his was that he practically founded Israel's intelligence network in Sudan and played a significant role in Operation Moses. Operation Moses was an operation where they secretly and intricately evacuated 7,000 Ethiopian Jews from Ethiopia to Israel. Now, this person, with this background, is the one who recruits and manages a high-ranking Syrian army general, codenamed Red Falcon, for many years, brings information from him, and practically turns him into Israel's most important agent in the entire Arab world. What we know about Gil is that one of the Mossad officials who saw his personal file says that he was born in Tripoli, Libya, in 1943, to Jewish parents, one Italian and one Greek. His grandfather was a rabbi, a Jewish clergyman there. From childhood, he learned different languages. They spoke Italian, French, and Spanish at home, and he learned Arabic in the streets. He also recounts some very strange memories of the violence that the people of Libya had against Jews, and he actually uses these as a justification for the hatred he later showed towards Arabs, saying that at the age of 12, his father gave him a gun and told him that if he saw Arabs arresting him for any reason, instead of surrendering, he should kill himself, as that would be better. It is probably with this background that when they later came to Israel, he joined radical right-wing groups, and his political ideology was like that. In these conversations he has with the journalist, for example, he says, "I know what bastards these Arabs are. I know what trash they are. You cannot trust them at all. You cannot trust a goy at all." Goy is a Hebrew word meaning someone who is not Jewish, a derogatory term. He says, even if a goy is 40 years old, you cannot trust him one bit. He uses very insulting and harsh words like these, which many Israelis are disgusted by, even if they appear to be learned and intelligent people. Of course, when he says these things, he then adds that he doesn't really hate Arabs, but the point is that he can never trust them. In 1948, he came with his family to the occupied territories to Palestine at a time when Jews were fighting with the Palestinians there, expelling them from their homes and gradually taking over their houses. He joined the Irgun, a partisan group that had already started fighting there, and they actually settled in one of these houses taken from Arabs. He grew up there. Then, in 1964, he was in the Israeli army. The army sent him to Chad and Cameroon to train military forces. This was a program called the Periphery Doctrine that Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, had. He used to say that, "We will always be in a state of hostility with the Arab countries around us. It's better to ally with the countries behind them, provide them with military aid and so on, and in return, they allow us to carry out and manage covert operations from their territory against the Arab countries." Gil had gone to Africa as part of one of these programs and was working there. In Chad, a Mossad official met him and told him, "You know all these different languages, come and work for Mossad." He applied, underwent extensive tests for 5 or 6 months, and was finally accepted. His acceptance was very important to him because he considered himself a lower-class person who came from an Arab country, and now he saw himself having access to the heart of Israel's established system. He was very happy and proud of it. In Mossad, they sent him to a college where they trained special people. These people had certain skills and learned other things. They became people who could play roles, who could manage others. They weren't like James Bond, who could fly planes or submarines, but they became intelligence officers with very high human capabilities. There's a section in Mossad called Somit. This is practically the largest and most populous department of the organization, with hundreds of people working in it, whether in the central office or in Mossad offices in other parts of the world. Mossad's main job is largely with human resources, which is why this section is so large. In this section, there's another smaller section where case officers work. These are the elite of the elite in Mossad, experts in the tricks and deceptions that can be used to exploit a subject's weaknesses and extract information, whether financial need or anything else. The people in this small group are those who can live with a false identity for a long time, without anyone having the slightest suspicion. Mossad's main asset for its operations, for the kind of work it does, is these people. Usually these officers have complete independence in managing their cases and are the only communication channel between the subject and Mossad. This means they work with 100% authority. This requires 100% trust, and it really had to exist. Before the Gil case scandal, there was absolute trust among people. The system was built in such a way that if there wasn't absolute trust, it couldn't work. From the time Gil started his work here, his competence was established very quickly and became exemplary. Everyone who worked with him said he was a person whose abilities in these matters seemed supernatural. He's very talented and also very proud. On the other hand, he's also someone who always complains to the organization, for example, that they don't appreciate him. He says, "Every course they sent me to after a day or two, the teacher came and said, 'Sir, I have nothing more to teach you.'" He worked for Mossad for 27 years, most of this time pretending to be a citizen of another country, meaning he performed high-risk operations, and there isn't a single operational error in his file.
He says this isn't because he's a genius. It's because he's a very timid and cautious person who checks every angle 1,000 times before doing anything and always prepares himself. His colleagues always laughed at him for getting so immersed in his role, but he said, "That's how I work with people. That's how I can work." In Mossad, the work of recruiting and managing agents is divided into 3 stages. Usually, 3 different officers perform it.
The first stage is identification, where someone goes, finds the subject, establishes initial contact, and builds a superficial and casual relationship. The second stage is attack, where the identification officer hands the subject over to the attack officer, who deepens the relationship and takes it to the level of exchanging sensitive information. Then they enter the management stage, where another person usually comes in and handles the subject for many years, getting information, taking them here and there, and so on. In the years he worked, Gil mostly acted as an attack officer and a management officer. This means he was the one who decided who and how to approach the target, what cover to use, how to compel them to cooperate, what the next meeting would be. He did this with a Libyan diplomat, with an Iraqi atomic scientist, with a Syrian general. Whoever it was, he was the one who decided. one of Mossad's chiefs who worked with Gil for years and later initiated the case against him, and who is considered an opponent of his, describes him as a very charismatic, very cunning person whose presence is almost hypnotic, and in improvisation and changing personality like role-playing, he's a phenomenon. He's a person who can convince almost anyone to do almost anything. We had a joke in the organization that Gil could even make a telecommunications tower talk. Gil himself greatly contributed to cultivating this legendary image of himself within the organization. In the courses he taught, he especially tried to impress young people. They say once in class, he pretended to have a heart attack and went so far that they had to call an ambulance. Or another time he pulled a weapon on one of his trainees in class and went so far that the person thought he had lost his mind and was about to pull the trigger and kill him, and burst into tears. He tried very hard to leave a dramatic and lasting impression on people who saw him even for a very short time, and thus gain widespread fame for himself within the organization. He also told many stories like, "I tricked so-and-so in Mossad like this," or "I spun so-and-so, a Mossad chief, around my finger like this," and it became part of his reputation in the organization. Now, in 1973, they were engaged in the operation of tracking and assassinating members of the Black September group when they contacted Gil and told him, "There's a very important mission, come to Paris." He asked, "What's more important than hunting down some Palestinians?" They said, "No, this is very important, come here." He went there, and they told him that a high-ranking Syrian army general was stationed in Europe for 6 months. This was a very rare opportunity for such a high-ranking person in the Syrian system, to be somewhere Mossad could access him for a long time, and they couldn't miss this opportunity. They had to try to recruit him. They gave him the code name Red Falcon, which I will use in my report. This person was someone for whom there was no reason to believe he would want to work with Israel. In fact, if anything, the opposite was true. Because that same year, Israel had reports that after the Tishrin War, Yom Kippur War, some Israeli soldiers who were captured in the area under this general's command were killed before reaching prison, and some of them were killed after reaching prison. And the rest, who were later released, said they were tortured and witnessed this person participating in the torture himself. Mossad's assessment was that this person either knew about the killing of those prisoners or even ordered it himself. Therefore, there was no hope that he would cooperate with Israel, but perhaps he could be persuaded to work with, for example, a European intelligence agency undercover. The reason Mossad was in such a hurry to recruit this person was that in 1973, in a war known as the Yom Kippur War in Israel, or the Tishrin War early in the morning of Yom Kippur, a day in Ramadan, Syria and Egypt launched a surprise attack on Israel and quickly recaptured some of Israel's occupied territories, especially Egypt, which had good advances. Later, this became known as the Arab-Israeli War. We are not concerned with the ultimate achievements of each side after the war, but the blow Israel suffered due to the military surprise at the beginning of the war was very severe, and after this war, Mossad was under pressure from Israeli military and political officials to recruit capable spies to prevent a repeat of this situation. These spies would bring confidential information from Arab countries and also provide access to the innermost layers of power centers in these countries, where strategic planning is done, where long-term plans are discussed, so they would know what was happening in areas bordering Israel. Before Gil arrived in Paris, a female Arab Mossad agent was tasked with establishing an initial superficial relationship with the general as an identification officer, and then bringing him to the next stage. This woman established that casual relationship, even going a little beyond casual, getting close to the person. But the general didn't give in to her. For example, he didn't attend any parties and refused to see any of her friends, and this plan failed. Then a second person named Gabriel entered the game. He went and formed a friendship with him, so he could bring him in as an attack officer. He also failed. Finally, when there were only 3 months left until the general's return to Syria, Gil was called from the middle of another mission and told, "Sir, come here. This is your job." He came and began to observe the general for a few days. What he noticed was that this person came from a respected and wealthy family in Syria, but here he seemed to be a little short of money. He was living in a cheap hotel, trying hard to maintain his appearance. His shoes were always shining, his suit was always sharply pressed, but he didn't take taxis. He always took the subway, buses, and walked around. It was clear he was in some financial difficulty. Among the three common hooks they used to recruit someone, money, sex, and emotions, history showed that the only option that might work was money. Gil's plan was to use the same Gabriel as an identification officer and try to rebuild and advance the relationship that he couldn't develop. The arrangement was for Gabriel to invite the general to an international conference on, for example, construction and development. There, Gil, as a successful and influential Italian businessman, would take over. A few days before the meeting, Gil started going to this conference, which was a relatively long conference. Gil began to show up there, gradually introducing himself to the hotel staff, visitors, and other people. After a few days, all the employees and reception staff thought he was one of the organizers. Everyone called him Mr. Boss. Mr. Boss, we have a problem here. Mr. Boss, we have an issue there. He would tell them, go do this, go do that, giving them orders here and there, and gradually gained a significant presence there. He would even say, occasionally, if I saw someone slacking off or not doing their job well, I would give them a warning. This also helped them to really believe that I was the boss. When Gabriel and the general arrived there, they saw that this person seemed to be in charge of everything. Everyone had badges on their chests, walking around. His name wasn't on a badge, but everyone called him Mr. Boss. It was clear that he was really someone important. Gabriel introduced him to the general as his father's old friend. Gil didn't even pay much attention, greeting him very coldly and in a hurry. The general was a little offended, saying, "Why didn't this friend acknowledge me?" Gabriel said, "He's the boss here. He's very busy. We should be very happy if we can sit with him for 10 minutes. After the meeting, Gil himself recounts, "A lady was walking by. I called her. 'Excuse me.' She had some brochures in her hand. I said, 'Come here, let me see.' I looked at the brochure and said, 'Yes, it's exactly as I ordered. Give 2 to these gentlemen.' The lady didn't suspect at all who he was or what he was saying. She thought, when he calls me and tells me to stop, he must be doing his job. Gil says that in these meetings, no one knows what's going on. If you play your role correctly and firmly, everyone believes you. In short, that night Gil took the general and Gabriel to a 3-star restaurant and talked to them a little. The next day, he took them to some presentations of projects he was supervising, with more fabrications. Throughout this time, these few days and later for several years, Gil concealed the fact that he spoke and understood Arabic perfectly from the general. Gabriel, on the other hand, began to encourage the general to have a relationship with Gil, saying that he was an influential Italian businessman and might be able to create some business opportunities for him. Then he told Gil's life story, saying that he came from a fascist Italian family who supported the Nazis and were anti-Jewish, and so on. After the war, his father, hating communists, started collaborating with the Americans, collaborating intelligence with the Americans, and, for example, gained many influential contacts there. He said, "When I told him this, the general started talking a little, saying, 'Yes, I'm also a military man. I have a lot of land. I have a very wealthy family.' This was also a little boastful, a little to attract attention and manipulate reality. It seemed things were going well. The next step was for Gil and the general to establish contact without Gabriel's presence. For this, the story they told was that Gil knew Gabriel's father when Gabriel was a very hot-headed young man and had promised him to protect this child. This way, Gil and the general became the main figures in the story, and Gabriel became the child whom they could order around and gradually exclude. Once, to ensure they were really wealthy and impressive, while Gil was talking to the general, Gabriel came in with a stack of papers and said, "This is the file for the last contract we were supposed to sign. I came to discuss it a little." Gil said, "Let me see." The papers, which Gil himself had prepared and given to the boy, were discussed for half an hour. Finally, he turned to him and said, Look, in the end, this will only give you, say, $500,000 profit a year. Is it really worth all this trouble and effort? He dismissed him. He says, "We were throwing these numbers around, and the general's mouth was watering." When this conference ended, Gil made a solo appointment with the general before they parted ways. In that meeting, the general turned to him and said, "Do you think these businesses could also be done in our country?" Gil says, "That's when I realized the hook was in his mouth and I had control over him." Gradually, he understood the general's personality better. He says he was a rural man from a region where water was very important to him, and he was always thinking about water and the outward appearance of things. He drank a lot of alcohol. He also had extramarital affairs, which Mossad had known about before, but he avoided talking about sex. It bothered him a little. Or he didn't like Western advertising with semi-naked women saying, "We are against these things." In a conversation with Gil, he told him that he hated Israel, but admired Israel's military capabilities. He also talked a little about his behavior towards the Israeli prisoners he had captured. Gil says, "I also encouraged him. I used to say, 'Well done, you did the right thing with these dirty Jews. That's how you should deal with them.'" He himself says that it was difficult for him to talk like that, but he thought that this way, his trust would be completely gained. He says he also criticized Hafez al-Assad a little, but said that he was an unparalleled leader. His ideal was to have a leader like Assad and an Israeli army, then no one would dare to challenge them. His hope and wish were to see Syria united with the Western world, not, for example, with Arab countries or the Eastern Bloc. In some of the first meetings, he also started expressing some financial concerns, a personal matter, and mostly financial worries. Gil told him that there were some business opportunities for Syria, and if he wanted, he could introduce him to people who did very profitable businesses. "I can connect you. You find an excuse to justify traveling to Europe, so you can come here frequently. I can arrange the rest. I'll connect you to the right people." The general said, "Coincidentally, I want to send my daughter to Europe to study, and I don't know how to raise the money." Gil says that this person was very naive. If he had applied to the French embassy, they would have easily given him a scholarship. I didn't know, and I didn't tell him. Instead, after a few days, I told him, "Look, I found a very good solution. There's a company that sponsors talented and promising young people, provided that after their studies are finished, they work for them for a few years. There's no paperwork, administrative work, or forms to fill out." He was very happy, and I called Mossad, and we essentially arranged his scholarship. Before returning to Syria, the general said, "I want something else. Now that I'm returning to Syria, this symbolizes a trip to the West, American home appliances. I want to take a large American refrigerator or an American washing machine to Syria." Gil says, "No problem, I'll arrange it." He contacted his colleagues in Washington, and they sent a refrigerator and a Westinghouse washing machine. When the general saw these, he was confused. He said, "I asked for a scholarship for my daughter. Bingo. I asked for an American washing machine and refrigerator, and they arrived. How is it that you have contacts everywhere?" Gil says, "This was the moment I was waiting for." This is when we transfer the relationship from shared interests and emotional exchange to exchanging confidential information. To open the discussion easily, I started telling him more about my father. I said, "Yes, my father worked for the fascist party, and he spied, and he worked for the Americans, and the connections he made with the Americans were so useful in business." After this, he said, "Your father was a very intelligent man. Look what he made of you." He was paying attention. He says that sometimes these Western intelligence services send me here and there to do sensitive work, for example, to conduct a deal for them, or to oversee a case, or to talk to someone. Today's global trade and global intelligence go hand in hand. Excellent commercial opportunities only arise for cunning people who understand how intertwined this intelligence network and commercial network are. The truly wealthy and powerful person today is someone who doesn't let things like ideology or national interests tie their hands, and is a person who knows how to skillfully navigate this international spiderweb and maximize their own interests, and so on. He says, "I told him these things," and the general turned around and said, "How much money do you make with these things you do?" I said, "A lot, because with these things I gain access to opportunities that no one else has. For example, a European country wants to refresh its strategic reserves, which it does once every 3 years. I buy their old goods that are in storage at a cheap price and sell them to a third world country, making millions of dollars in profit in the middle." Then I gradually made him understand that these things are highly confidential and should remain between us. And he initially agreed, saying, "Yes, I have no problem, I'm okay, I'm in," and so on, and went to Syria. He went to Syria, and they still weren't sure, because many people agree initially, take the money and initial gifts, and then go back on everything when they return to their country. But when he returned to Syria, after the first few weeks, he sent a letter referring to the money they had discussed. Mossad quickly opened an account for him in a Middle Eastern country and deposited the money, and the work began. The money, a few $1,000s, was not a lot of money for them, but it was a lot of money for Syria. You give your accounts, and he pays. And he returned to his sensitive post in Syria, and the spying game began from there. In the first 2 years, the information coming from Red Falcon was so valuable and high level that at first, Israeli officials didn't believe it, and when its accuracy was proven, they were all truly shocked. There is a research unit whose job is to analyze and evaluate intelligence. All intelligence units, whether Mossad, the army, the Israeli police, or Shin Bet, all the intelligence they collect goes here, to a place called Amman. This is essentially the authority for evaluating all threats and the authority on which military intelligence policies are based on their analyses and information. For example, its influence is much higher than that of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. Various Amman officials at that time confirmed that all the information coming from the general at that time was correct, and they say that most likely the general didn't know he was betraying his country. Because Gil, who is a master at asking questions in a way that he can maximize his own benefit, had assured him that the information he provided would never be used against Syria. After that, the working procedure was usually that each time he received new money, the less likely he was to ask questions about why this information was going or where it was going, and the less likely he was to back out of the cooperation and terminate it. In addition to the regular salary and the expenses for his daughter, he also told Gil that he wanted to go on a tour of Europe. Gil took him on a tour around Europe, and a group from Mossad secretly followed them, going here and there with them. After the trip, Gil says, he told one of these young Mossad officers, "This general came back on the ship and told me that this boy looks like an Israeli. And then these boys wanted to kick me out, and Gil himself intervened, saying, 'No, keep him for my sake.'" Later, the boy says that when he thought about it, he realized how strange this statement was, because his parents were European, and he didn't look Israeli at all. This was revealed in Gil's interrogation later, that this was a technique he used to get people in Mossad indebted to him, especially young people. He would put them at risk of expulsion or reprimand with such reports, which were often false, and then he would intervene himself. Then they would be indebted to him, and they would protect him throughout their time in Mossad, and he would exploit this debt. During the 25-30 years that Red Falcon collaborated with Mossad, he was one of the few intelligence sources whose information was so strategically important that it went directly to the Prime Minister and to Amman, raw and unanalyzed. In fact, Amman's analysts would accompany Gil to the city where he was going to meet before he met him. They would sit with him for a long time, practicing what questions to ask, what to say. They would say, "Our analysis is this. We think, for example, these are the probable options. Ask him. If he says this, say that. Later, if he says that option, then you do this until the last second." They would brief him like this, and then he would go to the meeting. When he returned from the meeting, they would immediately sit down and extract the information from him. Over time, Red Falcon had practically become Israel's most important intelligence source. However, Gil always went to the meetings alone. He never allowed direct contact between the source and any other person. At most, he would allow someone to sit at the same cafe where he was talking, or for them to watch from across the street. They also accepted this, saying that they didn't know how to play roles and might mess everything up. But this was later used against Gil in court. The only worrying aspect of the situation for them was that the general's daughter seemed to have caught on. She had told Gil several times, thinking he didn't understand Arabic, "Father, what are you talking about? You don't say such things to just anyone." For example, he was talking to him about Syria's political and military issues. She would say, "You speak too openly and easily," and the concern was that the daughter might be able to convince her father that what he was doing was not right. This was at the time when the general thought that Gil was actually working for NATO, and he was indirectly a NATO military advisor, and was being paid by NATO for the advice he was giving. However, the importance of the information he was providing was immense. He provided information about the Syrian army's new purchases, about military changes in the army, about the relocation of troops from one place to another, or about his attempts to change the law to remain in the center of power. Most importantly, he provided highly confidential information about the location of Syria's chemical weapon stockpiles. Each time they were scheduled to meet, a team, sometimes hundreds of people, would be put to work, from Amman's analysts who had to thoroughly prepare and analyze beforehand, to the security team, to the logistics team, to the safe house, to surveillance, to the money that had to be transferred. They didn't work this much for any other source. In 1981, Syria attacked the Christian Phalangists, Israel's allies in Lebanon. Israel also shot down a Syrian helicopter, and then Israeli jets flew over Damascus and Beirut, and so on. Tensions rose very high. Syria moved a lot of equipment and air defense systems to Lebanon, much more than it had before, and Israel became concerned about what Syria was really thinking, what its plan was. They called Gil, and Gil called the general and said, "Fresh fish has arrived in the market. Don't you want fish?" Meaning, "Come to Paris and meet me." He went, and there he confirmed that yes, these were the initial steps for preparing an offensive operation against Israel. Some Israeli officials at that time, like the head of Mossad or some military officials, were generals who had been scarred by the Yom Kippur War and held a lot of resentment towards Syria and the surprise attack there, and were looking for an opportunity for revenge. They took this news very seriously and wanted to send all the troops there. The head of the Syria desk in Amman opposed it, saying, "If we go, they will think we want to attack, and Syria has a very weak intelligence system. They know nothing about us from within." A severe division arose among high-ranking officials. Finally, Menachem Begin ordered the mobilization of military reserves. Syria realized this and thought that the plan was really an attack. They also prepared for a preemptive attack. The situation was truly getting out of control, so Israel sought help from America to assess the situation. Reagan sent someone to talk to Syrian officials, Lebanese officials, and Israeli officials, and individually assured everyone that no one intended to attack. Finally, based on these conversations, everyone was convinced and backed down. This incident was in 1981, and it was later revealed that Syria had no intention of attacking from the beginning, but these preemptive actions in Israel were very costly, both financially and in bringing the country very close to a military confrontation. Gil, however, when you talk to him now, denies that he said an attack was imminent. He says that his report had no time window. He said that Syria was engaged in strategic planning and thinking, and in that planning they were discussing, for example, where the final maneuvers would take place, where supporting forces would be, who would be deployed where, and so on. But he never said, for example, that they would attack today or tomorrow or anything like that. In 1989, the general retired from the Syrian army. Gil, on the other hand, was in a position for promotion and was close to becoming a manager, but they didn't give him the post. There's an internal belief that although he was very talented and skilled in his work, he lacked the teamwork and communication skills necessary for management, which is why he was never promoted. However, neither of them left the organization. The general remained in the inner circles of power as a military advisor and participated in confidential discussions. Gil, on the other hand, continued to work with Mossad as a trainer. After leaving the organization's employment, he started his own personal business and was very unsuccessful in it. Someone who worked with him said that for years, he had imitated different people and knew how to imitate a successful businessman and thought that business was really like that. He suffered a severe defeat, which caused him great frustration. However, at Mossad's request, Gil's contact with the general was maintained throughout this period. It was during this time that doubts and suspicions began to arise against him. A group began searching old files and came across a note that the head of the Syria desk in Amman had put on a Gil report in 1981, questioning the accuracy of the information Gil had provided. The suspicion at that time was not that the information was fabricated, but rather that Gil might have exaggerated in his reports to highlight his own importance and the importance of his source. As they investigated further, one scenario that emerged was that it seemed Gil, who spent a lot of time with Amman experts before and after meeting the general, and because he was a very clever and cunning person, appeared to be getting information and analyses from these people, meeting with this person, and then subtly altering what he had received from them and returning it to them. Some even went further and said that they might have been deceived and had entered a very complex double-agent game, and that it was the general who had recruited Gil and had been giving them false information for years.